vai nos falar, vai nos brindar com a palestra do branco ao preto, as partes 1 e 2 do Comentário Philosophique de Bayle. So, Michael Hickson holds a doctorate in philosophy from University of Western Ontario. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Trent University, Canada. His research focuses on early modern philosophy, the history of skepticism and applied ethics. He published Bayle's English translation of the Dialogues of Maximus and Themistius by Bayle in 2016. He is author of various articles in specialized journals, and in 2022 he was one of the finalists for the Humanities Social Sciences Decanal Teaching Award. Today, Professor Michael is going to talk to us about From White to Black, parts 1 and 2 of Bayle's Commentaire Philosophique. Thank you very much for your presence here, and we are here to hear this.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Does this work okay? Okay, I want to start by saying obrigado to all of the organizers, especially to Cecília and Todd, who have been wonderful hosts and have welcomed me and made this trip very pleasant. Thank you to all of the professors here from this university and other universities. It's been wonderful to talk to you and get to know you, to the students for coming, and especially thank you. The talks have been worth the trip. I've learned so much, and I have so much to think about going back. And so this has been a wonderful opportunity and a very great honor for me. I want to start with 3 quick apologies. So one apology is I really tried to learn Portuguese before I came here. But I used Duolingo. Do you know Duolingo? Yes, and I suppose nobody here has ever tried to use Duolingo to learn Portuguese, because why would you? You speak Portuguese. But they start with endless sections on animals and food. So I was training on things like o urso come o pau e bebe leite. This is all I can say are things about animals. So if you want to talk to me about uma fazenda, uma vaca, um cavalo, I can do it. But if I were designing Duolingo, I would have started with metaphysics and then epistemology and moved on. But that's not how it was. The other apology is that I was sick about a month ago and I have a lingering cough, so I might have to pause and cough a bit. And the third apology is more of an apologia, kind of classical apology in that sense. Why would I come here and talk about something so basic? I'm going to skim across the surface of a book that many of you have read in very great detail, Commentaire Philosophique, and I'm going to take a high-level view of it. Why would I do that? The reason is because there has been a growing sort of consensus that Bayle is not a skeptic. This has been sort of a surprise. I also think it's one of the most interesting research areas in Bayle scholarship today. I think some of the best scholarship is being done in this direction, and we've seen some of it here at this conference. Thinking about Jean-Luc Soler and Flavio yesterday, both presented non-skeptical interpretations of Bayle. So I hang on to the skeptical interpretation of Bayle, and what I would like to do is show you on a very high level why I will always believe Bayle is a skeptic on some level. I will take you to the text that I believe is the first moment in Bayle's oeuvre where he becomes a skeptic. There's nothing earlier that I think is skeptical in his work. I don't think his course was skeptical. I don't think his Pensée diverse is skeptical. I think he becomes a skeptic in the 9th letter of the Nouvelle Lettre. And then I want to show you a sort of skeptical reading of his Commentaire Philosophique that reestablishes his theory of toleration as a skeptical theory. Today I feel more at home. It was a skeptical Bayle that we saw today. So I think teams are forming here. Anyway, so that's my apology. Okay, I will just read this text and scroll along. So Pierre Bayle, 1686 to 88, Commentaire Philosophique, I'm just going to say CP from now on, is widely recognized as one of the first and most radical pleas for universal religious toleration in the West. It also has a reputation for being a notoriously difficult text to interpret. Like so much of what Bayle wrote, the individual sentences and sometimes even sections of the CP are clear and coherent, But when one steps back and tries to take stock of the work as a whole, problems arise. The main issue with the CP is that the second part seems to undermine the first part entirely. What begins as the work of a rationalist seems to end as the work of a skeptic. After demonstrating the immorality of persecution in part 1, the work goes on in part 2 to demonstrate that any person who is sincerely convinced that they must persecute indeed has the moral obligation to persecute. As Walter Rex observed, and if you have the handout, this is number 1. By the way, on the handout, I've in many cases given you a bit more of the quotation than what appears in the paper, so if you have some context. I don't think that's the case here, though. So first quotation on the handout. It seems almost perverseness on Bayle's part that so many of the earlier themes in CP1 reappear in this penultimate chapter of CP2, and that Bayle seems to be saying the exact opposite of what he had stated before. End quote. What should we make of the strange transition from part 1 to part 2 of the Commentaire Philosophique? I think this is the question about that work. Everybody who reads it and tries to understand Bayle on toleration has to deal with this question. For the most part, there have been 2 approaches to resolving this interpretive puzzle. The first is to affirm that CP2 undermines CP1 and to explain how and why this happens. The second is to deny that CP2 undermines CP1 and to explain away the appearance of contradiction. Let me call the first approach the paradoxical reading and the second approach the coherent reading. The focus and the test case of both readings for all the commentators who read on this problem is the persecutor paradox. It's the crucial objection that Bayle raises in CP2 against his argument for toleration, and that Bayle's earliest critics, notably Pierre, insisted was devastating. I'll talk about it more later on in more detail, but briefly for now, the objection is that if Bayle's argument for toleration is successful, then it will establish the obligation of some people to persecute, because he's going to base toleration in the rights of conscience. You have the right to follow your conscience. So if your conscience tells you to persecute, you have the right to persecute. So Baylean toleration will lead to persecution. The paradoxical reading of CP accepts this paradox as a consequence of Bayle's argument, while the coherent reading claims the paradox is merely illusory. The goal of this paper is to defend a middle position between the paradoxical and coherent readings. I think in the abstract I said I would defend the paradoxical reading, but I was rereading my paper, and I don't think I do that. I think I'm somewhere in between, actually. So I will argue the paradoxical reading is correct in that Baylean toleration does lead to a right to persecute, but that the coherent reading is correct, that this is not a contradiction or a refutation of Bayle's theory of toleration. So my approach is to place the CP in the context of Bayle's earlier letter on the rights of conscience, which is the 9th letter of the Nouvelle Lettre Critique of 1685 that Flavia discussed in long detail yesterday. I'll call that NLC9, or the 9th letter. In my view, NLC9 is Bayle's real masterpiece on religious toleration. It's briefer, it's clearer, and it's more rigorous than the CP. The foundations of Baylean toleration are laid bare in language that could not be plainer. Commentators have usually mentioned this earlier toleration work in their discussions of, this is going to be hard sometimes, of the CP, but few analyze it, and even fewer make connections between the structure of that work and that of the CP. So I will argue that so far they fail to appreciate that the nature of the transition from CP1 to CP2, that crucial thing we all have to deal with, it's anticipated and it's explained in the 9th letter. And it's described therein as a transition from white to black, which I think prepares us for the appearance of paradoxes in theorizing about toleration. Okay, so I'm going to start by giving a very different interpretation of NLC9 from the one that we heard yesterday. This is not a Thomistic reading of NLC9, although I have so much to think about in light of what I read yesterday, so I think it should be an interesting discussion afterwards. Surprisingly few commentators explicitly identify what they take to be the definition of toleration for Bayle. You can read a lot of articles on Bayle on toleration, and it never says what toleration is. It's kind of interesting, or persecution. Some leave the matter assumed, they think we all know what it means, while others would appear to equate toleration with the opposite of persecution, the nature of which is also often assumed. Most commentators acknowledge that Bayle's argument for toleration is moral, while Locke's, for example, is political. But there too, morality is broad, and as we'll see, it matters for assessing the coherence of Bayle's argument for toleration to identify what part of morality he is concerned with. The nature of Baylean toleration is clearest, in my opinion, in the ninth letter, the NLC 9 of 1685. So the goal of that letter is to defend a claim Bayle made in his earlier, looking back, Critique Générale of 1684, namely that, and this is passage 2 on your handout, I think I give you a little more context. If the true religion has a right to do something, then the false religion has the same right. So this letter thereby establishes the equal rights of orthodox and heterodox believers, which equal rights are the essence of Baylean toleration. I think what is toleration for Bayle? It's the acknowledgement and the respect for the equal rights of conscience of orthodox and heterodox believers. Everybody knows that, but I think it's important to say it and not confuse it with other things that are close to it, as we'll see. So, passage 3 on your handout. These, the orthodox, are the children of truth and believe that they are, while they, the heterodox, believe that they are, but are not. The fate of these two sorts of people are very different. But as for the right to respect and to cultivate what they take to be the truth, they are completely equal. Just as the supposed children and legitimate children of a man have an equal obligation to obey the one they believe is their father, and an equal right to share his inheritance. So I take this passage to be the conclusion of Bayle's argument for toleration in the letter, but also later on in the CP. Baylean toleration is the recognition of the equal rights of all people to respect and to cultivate the truth as they perceive it. This entails permitting all people to think, live, and act in accordance with the truth they acknowledge. So he'll say elsewhere, it entails allowing them to build churches, run schools, educate children in certain conditions, preach publicly, write books, refute views that they deem erroneous and harmful, and in general to love, proclaim, and promote a certain vision of the truth that a person believes in good faith. Persecution, on the other hand, is the denial of these rights to some people by physical or political or legal force or otherwise. So rights and duties of groups and individuals are therefore the parts of morality to which toleration pertains. I think it's important to bear this in mind, since some commentators will mistakenly write as if toleration is a matter of the achievement of individual moral goodness or virtue, which is a different matter. It's connected, but it's different. Toleration is not about becoming a good person or doing something that is morally speaking good. It's about respecting somebody's rights and giving them space to do things. That's different. Persecution, on the other hand, is a matter of denying rights to people. It's not, properly speaking, a matter of acquiring vicious habits, though it will probably go hand in hand with that, but a failure of recognizing and respecting other people's freedoms. That's the essence of persecution. At the outset of NLC 9, Bayle imagines an obvious and very strong objection to his conception of toleration. This is 4 on your handout. Is it not to the truth alone that the author of all things gave the right to enter into the heart and mind? End quote. The objector imagines that only the orthodox have the right to respect and cultivate what they perceive as the truth, because they alone possess what is really true in their minds. These orthodox, therefore, may deny these rights to others, since heterodox believers lack them. This, by the way, I think is really plausible. In a math classroom, you don't have to be tolerant. You do not have to respect alternate opinions in a math classroom. If somebody holds the opinion that 3 + 3 is 7, you can deny their right to hold that opinion. And if they continue to persist in it, you can tell them to leave the classroom. So there are certain domains, I think that's important to bear in mind. This vision of the truth, that just the orthodox have the truth and have rights, is plausible. And we actually live by that in some domains, usually in a physics classroom too, so we're defending toleration unusual location. So it's in response to this objection that Bayle describes the critical transition in thinking from white to black that's necessary to argue for his conception of toleration, and that Bayle will defend in the Letter on the Rights of Conscience and later in the CP. So this is 5 on the handout. It's a crucial passage, and I would say this is where Bayle becomes a skeptic. So this is the first passage. So he says, I agree with these objectors that if we consider truth and lies in a manner that's completely abstract, then only the truth has the right to demand our attention and to demand obedience. But it's something totally different when we descend from these abstract considerations and these logical precisions in which we see truth and error absolutely and in themselves. It is, I say, something totally different when we descend from these general views to the particular consideration of truth and error with respect to each person. It's almost always like passing from white to black. Absolute falsity changes into respective truth, just as absolute truth changes into respective falsity. That is, since I know well that not everybody is required to understand terms borrowed from the barbarity of the scholastics, that what is true in itself is not true with respect to certain people, just as what is false in itself is not false for certain people. End quote. I'm not saying that's skepticism, like on its own, but you're now starting to move in the direction of skepticism, and he's going to keep moving in that direction. I think that's what I want to show you. The transition in mindset required for Baylean toleration moves from abstract, general, universal considerations to those that are particular, individual, contextual. It's a transition from absolute to relative truth. Since, according to Bayle and following the scholastics, 6 on your handout, the ideas of God are the rule of absolute truth, end quote, we can say that this transition from white to black, or from absolutist to relativist thinking, is a transition from thinking about the mind of God to thinking about the situation of the individual human mind. Not to the human mind in general, however, which is itself an idea in the mind of God. Absolute and relative truth are not opposed. It's not that these are mutually exclusive, the way absolutism and relativism and morality are opposed to these. So the words, we have to be careful here. When our minds are working properly, the relative truth will just be the absolute truth perceived by us. So it's not as if one excludes the other. This is why the Thomistic interpretation, it's alive and well. I mean, you can come back with, there's going to be a debate here, but I'm going to push that this is moving towards skepticism. Bayle argues that the reason we must make this transition in perspective is because our subjects are rights and duties, which in turn, according to Bayle, rest on the following foundation. 7 on the handout. The rights that God gave to the truth depend on the condition that is so absolutely necessary that we cannot render without crime the least homage to the truth if this condition is not met. Now, by this condition, we must not understand anything other than that God obligates us to love and to respect the truth, provided that we know it. So, truth in the abstract, truth solely considered in the mind of God, has no right to compel us, and we have no duty to follow it. Truth must become individual. It must become the truth that I perceive before it can have any meaningful right to command obedience. Quote, oh, and I don't list this. Is this maybe just a continuation of 7? It's absolutely necessary in order for this right of the truth to be executed that it apply to John and to James and to other individuals that exist. Having made this distinction, Bayle goes on to develop a metaphor that establishes his desired conclusion that orthodox and heterodox believers have equal rights of conscience. Bayle imagines a master of a house who departs on a long voyage and leaves his servant behind to control who enters the house in his absence. The master commands the servant to give entry only to those people who hold a certificate marked with a certain insignia. So I think the meaning of the metaphor is very clear. The master is God. The master's order is the fundamental duty to believe and act on the basis of the truth. We are the servants, the house is the mind, and the insignia is the criterion of truth and goodness. Since the master is gone, the right to enter the house is entirely determined by the persuasion of the servant that the entrance certificate has the correct insignia. If the servant is convinced, then the person has the right to enter the house, even if the insignia is absolutely speaking a forgery. If the servant is not convinced, then the person lacks the right to enter, even if it is the master's own son who presents himself with a legitimate certificate. Now, in the lives of all of us, this seems to be Bayle's message, God is absent and inaccessible. You might even say this anticipates Nietzsche's God is dead. So our persuasion that some proposition is true is all there is to determine which propositions demand our respect and establish our rights and duties to act. Examples like these establish Bayle's stark conclusion in passage 8. Opinion alone constitutes the whole essence and foundation of the rights of the truth. Bayle entertains, so this, by the way, Bayle's not a skeptic. I think Jean-Luc was right yesterday. Bayle never has anything positive to say about Pyrrhonism. He is not a Pyrrhonian skeptic. You cannot say he refers to the Pyrrhoniens outrés and has nothing but disdain for them. Because I think he perceives that they think we ought to live by suspending our judgment. And that is not Bayle's philosophy. I think, I'm not going to pronounce this properly, José Mayanetto did extremely important work showing there's another kind of skepticism alive and well in early modernity, and Bayle is associated with it, academic skepticism. You don't have to suspend your judgment if you are an academic skeptic. You live on the basis of probability or on the basis of what Bayle would say are degrees of evidence. So earlier, Giovanni provided me with a wonderful passage that I had missed from CP 2.1, that all evidence is relative. Right? So this is Bayle's academic skepticism. You live by the criterion of truth, the only one we have, evidence, evidentia, evidence, but it's relative. It's yours, and it's probability, right? So you have opinion when God is not here. That's what you have. Bayle entertains the objection that he has confused necessary and sufficient conditions in this conclusion that opinion is the essence of rights. He responds that the opinion that something is the truth is not merely a necessary condition for our having the right to espouse it and cultivate it, but it's also a sufficient condition. The example he uses here is that of fathers and children. Try to move up a bit. If a man is unaware that he is the father of a child, then he has no rights over or duties toward the child. So the opinion that he is a father is a necessary condition for his having any rights or duties toward his children. However, the same holds if a man falsely believes he is the father of a child. So he thinks it, but he's wrong. He has all the same rights and duties with respect to that child as a real father while he believes he is the father. That's Bayle's example. Opinion is therefore a sufficient condition for possessing rights and duties. I take Bayle's examples, by the way, to be serious. I find them compelling. I know they're just examples. That's how he did philosophy. It's a bit different. It's not analytic metaphysics, but I find this is right. I just read that and say how true. Okay, so the relativist conclusion is that everyone has the right and the duty to act according to their opinions. There is a separate matter that is discussed by Bayle in these stories, but it's not strictly relevant to the issue of rights. And I think this is important because it gets brought up in many discussions of Bayle on toleration. This is the matter of the servant's blameworthiness if a thief fools him with a forgery, or if the master's son is turned away because of a blemished certificate. So what if the master comes home and finds out that you've let a thief in, or you've turned his very own son away who actually had a certificate, but it was dropped in the mud, so it didn't look like the right certificate? What happens then? Bayle repeatedly indicates that the servant is blameworthy only if he is negligent in examining the certificates. But the blameworthiness of the servant is something different from the servant's duty to give entry to a false guest and the right of that guest to enter the house. If the servant believes a guest has the right to enter, then that guest has the right to enter, and the servant must permit entry to the guest. Passage 9 on the handout. All the errors we espouse in good faith have the same right over conscience that orthodoxy has, whether we embraced those errors a little too lightly, or we made them pass through the most rigorous examination of which we are capable. Errors that are espoused through negligence, but believed sincerely and in good faith, still enjoy the same rights as the absolute truth, though we may one day pay for our negligence when we face God. So I think this is important. You may face God one day. God is gone. So what Bayle is doing is morality and politics while you are not face to face with God. And once in a while, he has a discussion of what's going to happen if you face God. And I think that's different. If you face God, you may well have to pay for all of these errors of conscience. But in this life, opinion is all we have. So that's what you go on. And if you think the son doesn't have the correct certificate, send him back. The takeaway of this section of my paper is that Bayle has identified two perspectives on the truth, the white or absolutist perspective, and the black or relativist perspective. He adopts only the relativistic stance of considering truth as it's believed by individuals in order to establish his toleration. It's surprising then that in his next foray into toleration in the CP, he first begins in CP1 from the absolutist stance, and then shifts in the second part to the relativistic stance, which causes a paradox to arise. So what I think looking at NLC 9 does is it prepares you for what you're about to see in the CP. He has shown you there are two perspectives on the truth, white and black, and what you're about to see in CP is an opening from the white perspective, and then immediately a shift to the black perspective. And the question is going to be, why would he do that? When in a previous work he defended toleration only from the black perspective. So that's what I have to tell you. So, okay, CP1, the white perspective. The particular aim of CP1 is to grasp what the author of Scripture, who is assumed to be God, means by Luke 14:23, compel them to enter, and in particular whether God commands thereby the persecution of heterodox religions. But how could Bayle or anyone know what God means or does not mean by the words of Scripture? So this question is answered by Bayle immediately in CP1, where he outlines the criterion of interpretation that he will employ throughout his commentary in CP1. Any interpretation of Scripture that establishes an obligation to commit a crime must be false. The basis of this criterion is the fact that God is perfectly good and cannot command moral wrongdoing without falling into a kind of self-contradiction. The question then becomes how to distinguish moral goodness and badness, because you have to identify something as a morally bad thing in order to say that that can't be what Scripture means. So Bayle's answer is the natural light of reason, which Bayle says is passage 10, God himself, the essential and substantial truth, who enlightens us immediately and who causes us to contemplate in his essence the ideas of eternal truths contained in the principles or common notions of metaphysics. The corrupt state of human nature causes us frequently to mistake our erroneous convictions for truths of the natural light, so Bayle provides readers with a test to determine what is morally good or morally bad according to the natural light. He's going to give you a perspective here. It's the white perspective, surprisingly in my talk. So passage 11 on the handout. I would like any man who wishes to know distinctly the natural light with respect to morality to rise above his personal interest and the custom of his country, and to ask himself in general, is such a thing just in itself? And if it were a matter of introducing it into a country where it was never practiced, and where the people were free to take it or leave it, would they find upon examining it carefully that it was just enough to deserve to be adopted? That's Bayle's own italics. I believe that this abstraction would dissipate several clouds that place themselves between our mind and this primitive and universal light that emanates from God to show all men the general principles of equity in order to be the touchstone of all our precepts and of all our particular laws, including even those that God reveals to us extraordinarily later on, whether by speaking to us himself in our ears or by sending us prophets inspired by him. The master has not left the house here, right? Like, he's whispering in your ear in this passage. When we read the methodological first part of CP1 in the context of NLC 9, it becomes immediately clear that Bayle is engaged in absolutist thinking in CP1. It's the white perspective. That is, his reflections are abstract, general, and universal. Note, those are words from NLC 9 to describe the intolerant person's objection. That's their perspective on the truth. That's what justifies their perspective. And those words appear in that passage I just quoted. So that's why I think we can be sure it's that perspective that's being adopted. The moral reasoning of CP1 concerns morality as it exists in the mind of God, as a set of eternal laws. CP1 is an exploration of what God should or should not do. Should he command persecution or shouldn't he? Now that's not a question that's not how it should be phrased properly. It would be which ideas are present in God's mind and which ideas are not present in God's mind, but we'll humanize God a bit here. The immediate subject is therefore divine ethics, or the eternal law. The perspective is that of the absolute truth, not the relative truth of John and James. So does Bayle now believe that toleration can be defended from this absolutist perspective, unlike in NLC 9? So I think the answer is no, and this is clear if we bear in mind that Baylean toleration is the view that the heterodox and orthodox share equal rights of conscience. The reason why I emphasize that, I said let's be really careful about noticing that, is because that claim is not defended in the first part of the Commentaire Philosophique. So the first, on my reading of the CP1 is not about toleration. So what is it about then? What is argued therein is that God did not command persecution, because persecution is contrary to his eternal ideas of goodness. The conclusion is we should not persecute. Not that we should tolerate, but we should not persecute. Not that we should respect the rights of all people to believe and act according to conscience. You might be thinking that's a philosopher's distinction. I don't think it is as subtle a distinction as it may seem at first. It's very different to say that we should not force people to attend the Catholic Mass, i.e. persecute them, on the one hand, and to say that we should recognize the right of those same people to build rival churches in the same neighborhood as Catholic churches. I can refrain from forcing you to go to my church, so I cannot persecute you, but I can also consistently hold the position that, but I'm not going to let you build a church next door that might pull people from my church. So I cannot tolerate you and not persecute you. So persecution does not entail, so non-persecution does not entail toleration. So the latter does not follow from the former. We can leave people alone, but still not tolerate their rights to proliferate their ideas. We have to wait until CP2 to get a reason to recognize the right of all people to act freely on the basis of conscience. The perspective will have to shift there from the absolutist to the relativist perspective. So you have an absolutist argument against persecution, but you're going to need a relativist argument to get toleration. It's instructive to view the differing ways in which Bayle considers the rights of conscience in NLC 9, because he does talk about that. I want to be clear about that. In CP1, he will talk about rights of conscience. As we saw in NLC 9, the rights of conscience were based in opinion, which was a necessary and sufficient condition for those rights. It was the whole essence. In CP1 chapter 7, Bayle takes up the issue of the rights of conscience, but discusses the right very differently. He argues that it's never permissible to compel consciences, to persecute, in other words. So again, he's arguing against persecution when he's talking about that, because nobody has the authority to do so. This is sort of reminiscent of Locke. The reason for this is that all authority originates from God, but God could never possibly grant the authority to compel a conscience without a contradiction arising in his will. This I want to suggest is pure absolutist thinking because the perspective is that of the absolute truth. Here's the passage, 12 on the handout. It's the same thing to command someone to act against his conscience and to command him to hate or despise God. Consequently, since God cannot grant the power to order someone to hate or despise him, it's evident that he cannot grant the authority to command someone to act against his conscience. Notice that the rights of conscience in this passage have nothing to do with individual human opinion that conscience is the voice of God. These rights are based in what is presented as an absolute fact that God could never grant the authority to another person to compel someone to act contrary to his commands. So the rights of conscience are developed in this chapter from God's perspective, not the human perspective, with the conclusion being limited to the claim that we must not persecute, not that we must tolerate. So that is my presentation of CP1. So now moving on to CP2. I'm going to take a drink. Sorry. So Bayle argues for toleration, that is, for the equal rights of conscience, for the first time in the Commentaire Philosophique in CP2, chapter 8. He states his intended conclusion early in this chapter as follows, 13 on the handout. Whatever an enlightened conscience permits us to do for the advancement of truth, an erroneous conscience permits us to do for whatever we believe is the truth. End quote. In other words, Bayle is arguing that we should recognize the equal rights of conscience of Orthodox and heterodox believers, not merely that we should refrain from persecuting them. Toleration is now the subject. And despite the fact that the terms eternal law and immutable law and God are everywhere in this chapter, I want to just acknowledge that because you'll go back and you'll say, hang on, this is the white perspective. The perspective is that of the truth relative to each person throughout. I'll try to demonstrate. So the main argument for these equal rights of conscience is that to act contrary to conscience is the greatest sin possible. And therefore we always have a moral duty to act in accordance with conscience. If our conscience forbids an action, even if the action is absolutely speaking morally good or neutral, we have a duty to refrain from performing the action. If our conscience commands an action, we have a duty to perform that action, even if it is absolutely speaking morally bad. Therefore, each of us has a duty to act in accordance with conscience, and a fortiori, a right to do so. I'm assuming Flavio made me think yesterday that maybe there's more to say here. I'm assuming that if you have a duty to do something, you have a right. I think Flavio has suggested, and I think others have suggested as well, there's a bit more in Bayle to connect those two, but they're absolutely connected in Bayle with right following from duty. So it's one of the costs of flying high over this text here. I apologize. Underlying all of this is Bayle's relativist perspective adopted in CP2, which he sums up as follows, 14 on your handout. It's the same thing to say that my conscience judges that an action is good or bad, and to say that my conscience judges that an action pleases or displeases God. This time, Bayle is establishing the rights of conscience not by absolute claims about the mind of God, as if he could know God or as if God were present, but by claims about what an individual believes about the mind of God. Opinion, in other words. Bayle considers the objection that one cannot have the duty or the right to do something that, considered in itself, is bad simply because conscience commands it. I think this is crucial to consider because it represents the reintroduction of the absolutist perspective into Bayle's relativist argument, and his response is reminiscent of NLC 9. He maintains that the will to do good is both necessary and sufficient for any action having moral worth. This is where I'm going to, so I see heads going, nope, this is where the discussion will happen. This is where page 27 of your paper is what I'm thinking about here. So he employs stories again. This time, the case of giving alms or delivering harsh words to a beggar. If one gives alms to a beggar without doing so from the motive of conscience, then the action is morally tantamount to a spring-loaded machine flinging a coin at the man. So if you're just handing over a coin to someone, there's no moral worth there, even if it improves the man's condition. You have to be doing it from the motive of conscience, or else what you're doing is just the same thing as a robot flinging coins at beggars, which can't have any moral worth. So the physical action of transferring coins has no moral value, even if it improves the condition of the man. I said that, so the motive of conscience is a necessary condition for moral worth. Don't think anybody's going to disagree. This is where the disagreement's going to come. On the other hand, if one delivers harsh words to a beggar, mistakenly believing he will use the money for ill purposes, but does so believing it's the right thing to do. So these things get complicated. So here is somebody begging for money. My conscience tells me this person, I think I've heard stories about this person. You see, this person takes the money and they go and they do bad things with it. So my conscience tells me this person doesn't deserve money. What they deserve is for me to tell them off. That is what I have an obligation to do. So if you deliver harsh words then, in this set of circumstances, believing it's the right thing to do, then the person who delivers the harsh words demonstrates at least the desire to please God by doing good, which gives the action moral worth. And I know the passage is quelque bonté morale, so it's some moral worth. But all I want to suggest here is Bayle is saying having the motive of conscience and acting on the basis of it is sufficient for providing some moral worth. There's something morally good about this action. So I think the second part is it's becoming very proto-Kantian. It's the will alone that is giving moral worth to actions. So I think Jean-Luc Solaire, among others, and I think Flavio now among them, I'm aware, it will object to this interpretation of Bayle. Jean-Luc writes that Bayle followed the scholastics in holding that, and this is 15 on the handout, the famous page 27, it's therefore necessary to distinguish my action as qualified by my intention and the moral value of the action in itself, that is to say, independently of my intention. And Jean-Luc suggests in his paper, which is hands down the best paper that has ever been written on toleration, as you may be aware, it won the Journal of the History of Philosophy Essay Prize. It was chosen as one of the top 10 papers in the Anglophone world in philosophy in 2018, I believe, the Philosopher's Annual. So this is an excellent paper, and I'm not saying it's not. I just have a disagreement with the interpretation here. So I want to just acknowledge what an excellent paper and how much I've learned from it. Having said that, I don't find strong support for this distinction between the moral value of the action as qualified by my intention and the moral value of the action in itself. That's a very mystic reading, so I think Flavio is going to like it. But I find passages like the following problematic for that reading. So this is 16 on the handout. The supreme judge of the world, the searcher of minds and hearts, cannot place any difference between two acts of the human will that are completely similar in their physical entity, even though by accident their objects are not really the same. For it suffices that they are objectively the same, that is, that they appear so to the two wills that form these acts. End quote. So I think that if Bayle believed, as Jean-Luc suggests he did, that the will was like the form of the action's material part, which I think is how Thomas Aquinas was presenting this, then God would be able to distinguish two completely similar acts of the will. One would be the form of this matter, and the other would be the form of that matter. So the object that the will is attached to as form to matter would give you the ability to distinguish between two acts, just in the same way that, if my medieval philosophy is correct, the human body does a lot of work in distinguishing persons. You have to have this individual. The matter is actually important here for individuating. But Bayle is suggesting the searcher of mind, God, can't find any difference between two acts of the human will. So it looks like will, the good will, is this Kantian notion of the good will is starting to be developed here. So Bayle insists there's no difference that even God can discern between two similar acts of the will. So to defend his interpretation of Bayle, Jean-Luc notes that Bayle speaks in terms of the sin of chastising the beggar, even though this is done in accordance with conscience. So if Bayle is going to speak about the sin of chastising the beggar, even though I did it from conscience, then he must believe there's some kind of absolutist perspective that we can take on the action. There's something bad about it. It was a sin. But I want to point out that in this passage, this is 17 on the handout, the sin is entirely reduced to the chastiser's precipitation in believing upon false appearances that the poor man is very bad, end quote. So I don't think there's anything absolute or independent of the will. There's no object that's doing that's turning this into a sin. It actually reduces to the will is not as good as you thought it was. The will was negligent in some respect. It was precipitous. So I'm trying out. This is an attempt here, an essay, that Bayle's morality is entirely based on the will. So he distances the sin from anything material, anything objective, mind independent. He insists that the good beggar is not chastised as such because he's not believed to be a good man, but he's chastised as an evil man. That's what the person thinks they're doing, is chastising a bad person. And this is crucial for understanding the nature of the actions. It just reduces to actually something wrong in the person's will. So note also that when Bayle speaks about sin in the passage, he writes not in terms of absolute facts about these matters, but he'll say things like il est défendu ce que l'on prend pour un péché. So it's compatible with the relativist reading of Bayle, that these things are prohibited, or we take these things to be sins, or sometimes he'll say it's incontestable that this would be good. Incontestable doesn't mean it's an idea in God's mind. Incontestable means no human beings are going to contest it, which I think is compatible with the relativist reading that I'm giving here. Okay, that's admittedly a rather quick overview of CP2. I'm trying to argue that it's that relativist perspective that's doing the work, and there's nothing absolutely creeping in to establish toleration. So now I want to turn to the persecutor paradox and show that there's something paradoxical about Baylean toleration, but there's still something valuable about what he's done, and we can resolve this paradox and show that Bayle is not contradicting himself. So the goal of this paper so far has been to demonstrate that there's really no single unified theory of toleration in Bayle's Commentaire Philosophique, contrary to what I think a lot of commentators try to do. They try to give you the argument from beginning to the end. Rather, there is an argument against persecution in part 1, offered from the absolutist perspective, and an argument for toleration, that is, for respecting the equal rights of conscience, offered from a relativist perspective. And tensions are going to arise from mixing these perspectives in the CP, as commentators have long noted. So in particular, here is the famous persecutor paradox. 18 on your handout, so we're nearing the end. Thank you for your patience. So the second difficulty that is proposed against me is that my doctrine entails the very reversal of what I want to establish. I want to show that persecution is an abominable thing. That summarizes CP1. And nevertheless, every man who believes in his conscience that he is obligated to persecute will be, according to me, obligated to persecute, and he will do evil by not persecuting. That's a conclusion of CP2. Different perspectives. I answer that since the goal that I gave myself in this commentary on the words compel them to enter, and notice, by the way, only CP1 is a commentary on those words. CP2 is not a commentary. The goal that I gave myself was to convince persecutors. That was the goal, to convince persecutors. It's a work of rhetoric. That Jesus Christ did not command violence. I myself do not ruin my design, provided that I show by means of good proofs that the literal sense of these words is false, absurd, and impious. If I even employ strong arguments, then I have reason to believe that those who examine them sincerely will clear up the errors of their conscience with respect to persecution. And in this way, my plan is solved. That's what he tried to do in CP1. I do not deny that those who are currently persuaded that it is necessary to abolish sects in order to obey God are obligated to follow the movements of this false conscience, CP2. And that by not doing so, they would fall into the crime of disobeying God, since they do something that they believe is in disobedience to God. But first, it does not follow that they do without crime what they do in accordance with conscience. Second, that does not prevent us from being obligated to protest strongly against their false maxims and to try to shine better light in their minds. And long quote. Commentators like Walter Rex have found the paradox devastating because it demonstrates that part 2 of Bayle's CP contradicts part 1. However, if we bear in mind that these parts have different conclusions from different perspectives, we see there's no contradiction. Absolutely speaking, Bayle is going to argue, persecution is immoral because it is contrary to the natural light of reason. I want to point out, I don't think I made this clear, so I need to pause and point this out. Bayle has said he's trying to convince persecutors. He has said in NLC 9, their perspective is the white perspective, the absolutist perspective, the perspective that my mind is always being enlightened by God's mind, the way that I was enlightened by the Brazilian sun today. It's just always shining on me. So he argues from that perspective. He enters their terrain and says, from your perspective, I'm going to show you that persecution is wrong. It doesn't mean that's his perspective. Relatively speaking, CP2, it's conceivable that someone could be convinced that God commanded persecution, and therefore this person would have the obligation to follow their conscience and persecute. A lot of commentators will say that's not possible. Bayle has demonstrated that is not possible. You could never possibly believe that. But then how have there been so many people who have believed that? If you take the view, and I can't cite it, but a lot of Bayle's debate partners will say things like, why would God give us so much clarity in the sciences? But then when it comes to matters that determine eternal life, he wouldn't give us clarity. So there's clarity in religion, and I have it. My church has it. I know that. So I don't have to. And your church is a threat to the eternal lives of my children. So I will not tolerate you because you are a threat, a mortal risk. That's, I think, a rational position to take if you believe in God and you believe that God enlightens minds. So I think that it is possible to believe, practically convincing myself up here, that persecution is somewhat rational on a certain level. So the result is that if you believe that, there can be an obligation and a right to do what Bayle has argued in part 1 is absolutely speaking immoral to do. This is not a contradiction. There's no logical contradiction, as much as it is a political and theological difficulty arising from the theory of toleration. It's a political problem because policymakers will need to move from Bayle's theory of toleration to a practical set of laws governing how society will deal with conscientious persecutors. No doubt the law will need to thwart their acts of violence and infringe on the persecutor's right to persecute in order to uphold the rights of conscience of everyone else. This happens all the time. It happens in Canada. There are some very famous cases that I teach in my applied ethics classes where the Supreme Court has said, yes, we have infringed on your right to freedom of religion. Yes, we did that. We did that to protect that person's right to freedom of life, to the right to life. So there are cases where sometimes you have to infringe on somebody's rights to protect somebody else's rights. It's just the world we live in, right? So Bayle doesn't get into that. Locke is much better on these practical problems, I think. Okay, it's also a theological problem because it's a problem of evil. If there is a God, God has established a world in which his creatures can have moral obligations to act contrary to his eternal laws. That's the world we live in. That's not our fault. That's a problem of evil, and as Bayle says in his early course, to his students in Sudan when he gets into the weeds of these things. He says, let's leave that one for the theologians. So his answer to the paradox above begins by noting there's no contradiction present and that the goal of his work is not undermined by the existence of conscientious persecutors. His goal is to convince such persecutors to change their minds. That's why he adopts their absolutist way of thinking in part 1 of the CP to argue against their interpretation of Luke 14:23. If he is successful by giving them arguments that they find compelling, then he will have shown that their acts of persecution are absolutely immoral, even if done in good faith. Bayle recognizes that the paradox boils down to a practical difficulty with his theory. In a world in which conscientious persecutors may exist, we all need to hit the streets and protest against their actions and try to educate them. So it boils down to reforming schools and protesting. The resolution of the persecutor paradox just given differs from other interpretations, so those offered by Gianluca Mori and Jean-Luc Soler, for example. So Mori contends that the paradox arises because Bayle's theory of conscience shifts at some point between part 1 and part 2 of the CP. I don't believe that's the case. Rather, the perspective shifts from the absolutist perspective, which considers the eternal law in the mind of God that enlightens consciences, to the relative perspective, which considers the human mind that struggles to receive that light. The shift is from the absolutist morality as it relates to humanity in general to the individual rights and duty of John and James. My resolution differs from that of Jean-Luc, whose analysis tends to offer, I think, but this is an interpretation of Jean-Luc, a more absolutist reading of the whole of the CP. In the end, Jean-Luc argues that Bayle has demonstrated that nobody can sincerely believe that persecution is morally permissible because it's so opposed to the natural light. I think Bayle can hope that that's the case. That's what I think he's saying he's tried to do. But I think this position, while plausible and extremely well argued, ignores Bayle's claim quoted above. Sorry, I forget the number. You'll find it though. That the right to obey conscience exists, even if one's conscientious beliefs have been adopted rather hastily. The essence of the rights of conscience is sincerely held opinion. It's not well-informed opinion. So the conscientious persecutor indeed has the right and obligation to persecute, even if they haven't examined things carefully, even if we can critique them for not being very smart. That's a practical issue to be dealt with by the magistrate. The sincere persecutor paradox is, as Bayle admitted, an embarrassing and troubling difficulty for his theory of toleration, but it's not a contradiction within the theory or a reason to abandon it. I think there's still, at the core, a basic kind of respect that we all should show one another, and that I think today we do show one another to a great extent. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael, for this great conference. Now I would like to ask for the audience if there are any questions. Of course, Flavio.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. Excellent conference. Very interesting. To be honest, I think I will have several questions, but I'll make just two. The first one has to do with the definition of toleration. You propose that toleration is different from non-persecution. Well, I agree with you that in the Commentaire, Bayle gives no definition of toleration, neither in parts 1, 2, 3, and even in the supplement. But in a letter to Constant, letter 749, he makes a remark on Gédéon Houet, and he draws the distinction between ecclesiastical toleration and civil toleration. And when he goes into details about civil toleration, he says that it's nothing but the isention de loi pénale, suspension of penal laws. That's toleration according to Bayle. As far as I can see, the elimination of the penal laws, so toleration, is the same thing of non-persecution. So, as far as I can see, as I said, there is no impact, there is no difference. What I mean by that the main goal Bayle has in both parts of the Commentaire class 1 and 2, those you focused on, is the same, that is to prove that the magistrate has nothing to do with the promotion of a religion. So he cannot enact laws to discriminate the so-called heretics. That's, as far as I can see, as I said, Bayle's goal. Well, my first question has to do with this definition. And my second question, you showed us page CP1, first chapter. In this chapter, Bayle proposed a sort of criteria to interpret the Bible. When you write, I quote, any interpretation of scripture that establishes an obligation, etc. And this is in the absolutist perspective, as you said. Well, you proposed as well a difference in part 1, between part 1 and part 2. I think, on the other hand, by contrast, that this principle that I just pointed out to is also present in CP2. And it's essential for the reductio ad absurdum that Bayle elaborates. So I would like to listen to you about the reasoning. Bayle himself says that he does. He tries to reduce the intolerant principle to the absurd. In order to do so, this principle, hermeneutical principles, so to say, is necessary. If that's the case, it's also present in the part 2 of the Commentaire. That's my second question. Is it clear?
I don't understand the second question, sorry. So you're saying that the rise above your personal interest and imagine this is being proposed to a country, so on and so forth, you find that test being used in CP2?
All right, we'll make the question in another fashion.
Yeah.
How do, in the supplement, as I showed you yesterday by quotation, Bayle says that his reasoning is a reduction. Okay? So, a reduction to absurdum.
Right,
okay.
Yes.
That's the way Bayle himself sees his reasoning. So, I'd like to listen to you about this reasoning.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So I answer now? No, I wait for more questions.
More questions? Professor Jean-Luc.
Yes, of course I feel compelled to say something. Although it's going to be difficult because I came unprepared to have this discussion. So I try to gather what I remember of the Commentaire Philosophique, because my article that you were enough to mention and praise is already a bit anxious. I forget very quickly what I read it. But yeah, you were right, and you saw it at my reaction, that our fundamental disagreement, I think, is about your suggestion that there would be a right of an erroneous conscience to persecute. Because, for what I understood, you say that provided that the intention is right, in a sort of casual way, then this justifies the action that makes the action good. I totally disagree with that. You mentioned my pointing out that the example of the bigger who is falsely believed to be a cruel scammer, and that we send off with harsh words. You mentioned that I was pointing out that Bayle talks about it in terms of signities and evil action. If I go back to what he says himself, CP2A says the evil, the man of this action of sending off the alleged scammer, the evil that I will do in that case does not proceed from the desire to disobey God, as it's done in accordance with one's conscience. So I believe that I am obeying God here. But the evil doesn't proceed from that, obviously. It proceeds from my precipitation in judging this person to be a scammer. But this is what I call in the article materially bad action, because it is offending an innocent, right? It is being unjust to the innocent person. So in itself, intrinsically, it's something bad. And Bayle confirms that it's a lesser sin than doing something against one's conscience, but it's still a sin, an evil action. And the fact that I am obeying my conscience does not transform it negatively into a good action. So I do not believe that the purity of the intention is a sufficient condition for the goodness of the action. It is a necessary condition that by itself it doesn't make an action to be good. It's not at all sufficient. But there is a scale of evil actions. It's a less evil action than acting against one's conscience. But that doesn't make it a good action. If we concede that, then I think it's the end of Bayle's theory of toleration, including part 2. And I think that the whole thing collapses in that case. We have nothing to object to sincere persecutors. And what Bayle will never get what he wants, that is to show persecutors that if we follow their principle, then it's going to be chaos in this world. That's what he wants to establish. It is his argument in the first part, right? That if we follow that principle, that everybody is going to kill everybody. And the true church will be annihilated as much as any heretical church. So I think it's a moment of decision. Either the theory of toleration stands or it does not. So I will remark that let you respond to that.
Any further questions? Cesar?
For the conference, and first I would like to make a commentary about the relation between skepticism and Bayle. And I think there is a tendency with philosophers to not wanting to join a club who accepts them. And I think that is projected in Bayle, because skepticism accepts Bayle as one of them, and if we don't accept Bayle, and the dogmatic school will not kill him. So I think it's nice to make this relation between skepticism and Bayle, and make Bayle feel at home with their Pierre philosophers. And second, I would like to ask you about the why persecution cannot be called intolerance, if there is a reason in your argument, and every time call persecution, and don't bring another word, persecution, and call it intolerance. And my second question, it's about the perspective about tolerance, because as I see the tolerance tradition, it's about the dominance, the political dominance, speaking about toleration as a way to keep the public sphere, to keep sovereignty. And I think Bayle's perspective is a little bit different because Bayle is a persecuted, and he has a different perspective. So I think when Bayle talks about tolerance, he's speaking about his own life and the necessity to not totally trust about the other, and also the necessity to have a sovereignty who can be between the bad feelings and the wanting to persecute and me and my religion. So I think maybe there is a place in your argument to this persecuted perspective, and I think that the theory of toleration changes itself if we assume this perspective of the persecuted. And my last question is about sovereignty. There is a place to think about Bayle theory of toleration without sovereignty. Toleration is all about moral, and it can stand by itself without sovereignty in the political sense. So that's my question. If we can really understand the toleration in Bayle without thinking about the possibility of politics between the one who wants to persecute and the persecuted.
Now I will answer. No, I won't. I will just keep trying because that's what this was. It was an essay, and thank you for these excellent questions. I came here to get these questions and bring them back and put the paper, and that's, I hope, what will happen. So thank you for helping me with that. If you don't mind, I'm going to take things sort of out of order because I was making connections between things, and I want to make a connection immediately between two things that I heard, one from Jean-Luc and one from César. So the César's third point, as I took it, the Bayle's perspective as a persecuted person, and how is that playing into, I think that's central. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I really want to bring that out and emphasize that in a future edition of the paper. So Bayle felt deeply what it meant to be regarded as less than the people around him, as not having moral worth, as being wrong, and despite all his best efforts and living to the best of his ability, being seen as somebody who could be kicked out of the country, who could be chased around the country, whose brother could be killed, and so on. So yeah, he felt that very deeply, right? So I think that that's important. That's why I see Baylean tolerance. So I'm going to have to think about this letter to Constant, where Bayle says toleration is the elimination of penal laws. What I was trying to show in the paper is that when he identifies conclusions of the work, that's what I kept putting in front of you. Here is his stated conclusion. it says that the Orthodox and the heterodox are completely equal with respect to their rights of conscience. So maybe I have to rephrase, maybe I have to say not that this is Bayle's definition of toleration, although there is a passage that I want to come back to you about that. But maybe what I should say is the goal of the work. Let's be clear about what the goal of this work is, because that is phrased consistently in NLC 9 and CP 2 as the establishment of equal rights of Orthodox and heterodox people. So I think this is important because this is what Bayle cares about. He cares about having others recognize the rights of the people around them. Okay, this is where I want to now go to Jean-Luc's most, I think, most important objection for me is that if we don't recognize, if we recognize the sufficiency of following conscience for establishing moral worth, then that's the end of Bayle's theory. So my response to that is exactly the opposite. If you do not recognize the sufficiency of following your conscience for establishing moral goodness, that's the end of Bayle's theory. Because I think the theory, this is why I'm connecting you to, the theory is to get people to see that those around them can be morally good. They can be good people, worth having around you, as long as they're following their conscience and living according to the fundamental duty to love the truth that you perceive and try to cultivate it to the best of your ability. I think by not recognizing the sufficiency of conscience for establishing moral worth, you leave open the mathematical model that I was presenting. A religious persecutor can think like a mathematician and say, you are just a bad, I get it that you think 3 + 3 is 7, but you are just wrong, and you're actually somebody who needs to just get out of here because you're a danger to the classroom by having that belief. I think it's only by recognizing the sufficiency of conscience that you recognize some moral worth in all people. Otherwise, you just have poor people to pity, really. They're trying, but failing. So that would be, that's, I think, what's motivating me is believing that we need that sufficiency. Now, will Bayle's theory fall is another really crucial objection. That's what I was trying to do in my admittedly very brief look at the persecutor paradox. The theory doesn't fall because he said, my goal is to convince people. So I think as philosophers, we sometimes don't take these types of things seriously, that sometimes there are philosophers who are not like they are not like Spinoza. They are not trying to lay out a geometric system. What they're trying to do is convince people, and that's why they use funny stories, and that's why they write beautifully, and that's why they throw in a few lewd stories, because that's what's going to get the readers, and he's doing everything he can to persuade Now, in this particular case, CP1, what is going to persuade a persecutor is saying, hey, like you, I think the light's always shining on us, and we're always connected to God, and God is right there in my mind. And we just have to follow this rule of imagining the action in itself and adopting it in a country, which is Kant's categorical imperative, by the way, long before Kant. Just follow this and you'll find the truth. And then he lays out arguments showing that it leads to persecutions and bad things. So it's ultimately persuasion. So his theory doesn't fall if he persuades people. And that can happen even if there's this paradox. Now, the paradox is not a contradiction because, as I was trying to say, and then this connects now to another point by Cesar, that we need to get politics. Bayle didn't do the politics. He wasn't like Locke. Locke was very good on the politics of this, separating church and state and going through problem cases, cases where, for example, in church, like cases where the civil and the religious are actually blurred together, like what if we sacrifice cows, but there's a lack of cows? What do we do? Do we have the right to prevent these people from sacrificing cows because we need cows? Locke is great on that, Bayle is not great on that, but Bayle needs that. So he needs politics to come in. And I don't have much to say. I know I'm sitting next to somebody who has a lot to say about that who can help me, but I don't have those things to say about what Bayle actually would have thought. But I think that his tendency toward monarchism is the belief that you need somebody strong who's going to fix these problems really cleanly. All right, I know I'm flying around here and probably not satisfying anybody yet. Flavio, the definition of toleration, I think I mentioned that, so I'm going to have to look at that. The reductio ad absurdum point. So this, I tried to make this, I didn't make this point clear enough. So I think the commentary, the part that deserves the title commentary, is part 1. And that is a reductio ad absurdum. Part 2 is not a reductio ad absurdum. So his argument against persecution, aimed at convincing persecutors, is a reductio. So that's only to do with part 1. And then when it comes to part 2, that's presented as replies to objections. And those sometimes involve a reductio, but sometimes they involve positive philosophizing on his part, which I think he's doing when he's establishing the equal rights of conscience. I don't think there's a reductio that if we don't recognize the equal rights of conscience, we run into a contradiction. I don't think that's how it works. It works with stories that try to show that there are these equal rights and duties of people who have true beliefs or false beliefs about facts and about morals, and he's acting like a positive philosopher there, whereas in part 1 it's reductio. If God commanded persecution, then here are 9 things that would be absurd consequences of that command. But part 2 I don't think is structured that way, so that would be my response to that. Why is persecution not intolerance? I think, so again, I just think that for Bayle, even if, so some of you might know the history better than I was, even if Bayle is not in his youth being forced to attend a Catholic church, is being left alone in his little Huguenot village, not being persecuted, he is not being regarded as having the same rights and having the same moral worth as the people around him. So that is intolerance, and intolerance doesn't always lead you to doing bad things to people. So I think we are very, so I know Canada, I think probably Brazil is the same. Canada, we're very good at not persecuting people, but I think we're intolerant. And I think we don't recognize the equal worth and the equal rights of all people. And what's important to distinguish there is that that's really difficult to see, to detect, and to do anything about, whereas persecution is very simple. You see that, that's external acts. So I think that's why I think it's interesting and important to make the distinction that I think is there in CP 1 and 2 between arguments against persecution and arguments for tolerance.
I did not kill my friends, but if I did, I had no intention. If I had an intention, I didn't do it with an axe or with a gun. So there is no contradiction between the arguments. They are defensive arguments. And I have an impression that Bayle is making a style of argument like a lawyer defending someone. So you cannot persecute, but if you do, there is something you cannot do. And I don't think there is a contradictory relation between the two statements. And I would like to hear if you have the same impression about the style of argumenting in the Commentaire Philosophique.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's really interesting. So sometimes he says, I think he's using terms. I might be wrong that these are from the law, but he'll say sometimes I want to lay out my argument in form. Like so, he'll just start to go and say point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and it does sound very legalistic. And I agree with what you just said about the sort of legal rhetoric almost of what's going on in the work. The reason why that's really interesting, though, is one of the passages that gets used to justify the interpretation of Bayle as an academic skeptic is this passage from the dictionary. I forget the location. Somebody will know it, where he distinguishes two types of philosophers: the lawyers and the reporters.
Oh, yeah.
Where is it? Chrysippus? Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and so a lot of Bayle scholars have used that and have said, Bayle he's not a lawyer, he's a reporter. Look, the dictionary, Tom Lennon, for example, says that the dictionary is very much laying out the views of other people, reporting their views, putting them in dialogue with one another. I really love that interpretation, except when you read the dictionary, Bayle doesn't report anything people say. He uses people like Melissus and Zoroaster, uses their names, and then puts all his own thoughts in their mouth, which is worse than a lawyer. So I don't know, it's tricky to pin him down with a label like lawyer or journalist or critic, but it's an interesting perspective.
Okay, I think our time is up. But
Thanks, Mike. Just real quick, I really thought that was a great paper. I mean, it sounds like the fruit of many years of thinking about Bayle and toleration and like kind of a culmination of your father's points. So I know you said you're presenting at a high level, but I thought it was a really impressive piece of work. I won't enter into the details. I'll let the experts do that. I just wanted to ask you a quick question about how you began the paper. Right, you said that there's this movement away from thinking of Bayle as a skeptic, but that you think that he is, and if I understood you right, kind of the principal evidence that you cited was, here in letter 9, this is where we see Bayle skepticism first manifest itself. But I just wanted to invite you to say more about why you think that at least what you cited there constitutes skepticism. Yeah. Right? I mean, he talks about the relativity of truth. But it seems to me that I mean, we can talk about that, but the examples he gives, for example, a father who thinks that someone is his son, or the guardian who mistakenly, right, looks at a piece of paper and thinks it's an invitation, but it's not. That's just a mistake. That's not skepticism, right? I mean, it seems to me like you don't want his theory to turn on skepticism, right? It's fallibilism, right? We can make mistakes. Because what you said later, right, which is that it's just sincerely held opinion, right? So even if some people can know the truth, right, even if the truth is possible, right, if we're fallible, then it's always going to be possible to have a sincerely held belief, and that's enough for Bayle's theory for toleration. So it seems like insisting that the theory requires skepticism, like no one can know what the truth is, right? That feels like it's too strong for what you want, and so, or at least for your reading. And so I just wondered if you really think that what Bayle's doing in letter 9 is positively asserting skepticism about these truths.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's a really great question. So first I want to comment on a point that I made that I want to emphasize again. I really think that the work of Jean-Luc and Flavio and Todd, I think your book was one of the first sort of recent pieces of research to try to do this, to point out to things Bayle really believed, positions he stood by. I think this is work that's really going to help Bayle. Bayle is going to, he'll go from minor to major figure only if people think there's a philosophy there, right? And as long as the Bayle enigma is alive, and even Bayle scholars are saying there's really nothing here that's definitive that we'll ever agree on, I don't think people will ever hang on to it. That's why I think the work that's being done is probably the most interesting and important work. I just happen to think Bayle's a skeptic, so, and an enigma, so I can't. So I'm not helping Bayle, but I'm just following my conscience. Okay, but in what sense do I think he's a skeptic? So the first point, I think, and I thought about this. Skeptic is not a natural kind, right? Like skeptic is a historiographical term. It's a term historians of philosophy use if they find useful, and don't use if they don't find useful, and it's supposed to do organizational work for us. So why I use it is because I think it's helpful. Why do I think it's helpful? I think it points to, so in this particular case, I think it points to a foundation that is constant from NLC 9 on, according to which Bayle believes in the truth. I don't think I said this enough in the paper. Bayle, like skeptics, like Pyrrhonians, and like academics, believe there is truth, and believes you can't know that you have the truth. So it is there. There is a truth of the matter. It is in the mind of God. God's ideas are the criteria of truth. And when he says the master has left the house, I think he is making the claim, the claim that's common to all kinds of skeptics, that you don't have access to the truth. It's there, but you don't have access to it. And so there is no certainty to be had. As Giovanni's quotation, his excellent quotation, all evidence is relative. And so I think he's a skeptic in the sense that he's never going to believe that you have the truth of the matter. So I think that's important to, so that's why I want to offer this sort of general interpretation of Bayle's theory of toleration, because there's a movement, Maury and McKenna especially, I think about them, according to which Bayle in CP1 is showing he's a moral rationalist. And you have to recognize he's a moral rationalist to understand the rest of his writings, and to understand especially his treatment of the virtuous atheist. And moral rationalism is this belief that you can have the truth. You can have the truth about morality and basic truths of reason and metaphysics and other disciplines. And I don't think Bayle thinks that. I think there are just degrees of evidence all the way down for him, and that's what I mean by skeptic. So I'm not really interested in saying he's this school or that school. I'm interested in the claim that he believes there's a truth, and we are cut off from it, and all we have is opinion, and we have to live our lives that way. And I think that was another point of César's. Like, I love skepticism. I think this is my philosophy. I think it's a great philosophy because I think it tries to grapple with the question of what do you do when you can't be absolutely certain, and I think that's the condition we're in. But I think a lot of people don't know that we're in that condition. They think they have certainty. They can have certainty in a lot of domains. And I think the skeptic is the one who goes out and tries to remind people by whatever means possible, stories, whatever, that you don't know as much as you think you do. And it's not to be annoying, it's to humble people and remind them of the value and importance of just living according to your best assessment of things. So I think that's a good philosophy, and I think that's that's why I think Bayle is an important philosopher worth reading alongside Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, Locke, anybody else. So.
Okay, if there's no any questions, we are really, our time is really, we are atrasados, we are so behind the schedule here. So I would like to thank you everyone for being here, and we can continue this stimulating discussion in dinner, having some dinner, and tomorrow at 10 a.m. You're all invited to be here to continue these great talks. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.